As you all know, I'm a junior researcher here at the Fulbright Institute, and I'm going to be talking about research that I've been doing over the past year and a half, starting in the summer of 2014, where I first started doing research work with marriage migrants from the Philippines and Vietnam. Specifically, women who are coming over to South Korea for the purpose of getting married to a South Korean man and eventually having children and starting multicultural families here. I look at, hold on one second. So I'm looking at how the assimilation process goes for these women and for their children, and what sort of identity politics is attached to this process. And while I was doing research with these group of marriage migrants, I realized that there was an extremely significant group that could help me understand how they were assimilating into South Korea. So, and that group was North Korean refugees, because I was looking at ethnic identity for these marriage migrants, and the best way to look at the ethnic identity is to look at ethnic nationalism in South Korea first, to see how Korean identity itself is getting formed and projected here in South Korea, and how these marriage migrants are responding to and assimilating to this projection of identity. And one thing I was learning in my research is that a lot of this ethnic nationalism is derived from the time when North and South Korea were splitting. And because of that, I sort of transitioned from my marriage migrant project into this project about North Korean refugees. And to see how those two groups connected together, how they were assimilating into South Korea, and what kind of things were exerting sort of pressures or influences on the way they view themselves and others. So that's pretty much why I chose the topic. Okay, so the research question I'm looking at is, what is the process of Korean identity formation in marriage migrants and their families? So this is an outdated PowerPoint, so it should actually say the formation in migrants and their families. So this research question kind of has been driving the research that I've been doing for the past year and a half, because it's not only about Korean identity formation for these migrants who are assimilating into Korean families, but also for these North Korean refugees who should supposedly have a much easier time of assimilating into South Korean society. They share this ethnic and historical background together. They're supposedly from the same ancestor, Tangun, a single lineage, sort of this blood ideology that is part of the history talked about both in North and South Korea. So I'm looking at both of these groups to sort of answer this question about Korean identity formation and how migration impacts that formation. Okay, so the research methodology I use is mainly ethnographic fieldwork. So I do interviews, I do participant observation, I do various activities with the group of people I'm in to sort of get this insider perspective as much as possible as I can. So for the first project that I did in 2014, I did around 30 interviews with Filipino and Vietnamese marriage migrants, their husbands, and if the children were old enough, I would do interviews with them too. But to really get that insider perspective, I also did participant observation events. I attended church services, I did English tutoring with their children, I attended dinners, I went to birthday parties, sort of just to get to see how they interacted with each other and how they interacted with people outside of their own social group. I did the same thing with the North Korean refugees, so it's an ongoing project, so I'll end up doing around 45 to 50 interviews. 30 of those interviews, 25 to 30, will be with South Korean Christian missionaries or people who have sort of this heavy influence on North Korean refugees and their lives here in South Korea. And then about 20 to 25 with North Korean refugees to talk about how they're adopting the life here in South Korea. And of course, since it's ethnographic fieldwork, I'm also doing participant observation events with the North Korean refugees. So that also includes going to dinners or attending birthday parties, but also attending human rights activist events for North Korea, doing English tutoring again, attending prayer meetings, anything that sort of gets me that inside view into North Korean life here in South Korea. Okay, so the slides may be a little mixed up. But so the first thing I want to talk about is sort of the historical processes that have occurred in South Korea that had a lasting effect on these migrants and act as sort of push-pull factors in addition to influencing their lives here in South Korea. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the economic modernization of Korea's economy. It happened in the 1970s, was when it really started fully going its way. So in the 1970s, when Korea's economy started to modernize, a really interesting phenomenon occurred. A lot of young marriageable South Korean women were moving from rural areas, from fishing villages, from farms, and going to very urban areas like Seoul, Ansan, Pyeongtaek, and leaving behind a lot of bachelors who were in need of eligible women to marry and have children and help them run these farms and fishing villages. Because this was happening, the South Korean government decided to implement these programs, one of which, this is my favorite title, is Bringing the Wailing Cry of Children Back to the Countryside. So they were implementing these programs to bring back as many young South Korean women to rural parts. But it wasn't working. So what they started doing, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, was programs that encouraged foreign wives from other countries to come to South Korea. So you have women coming from China mainly during that time, but also from Southeast Asia, like the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, and really from the Southeast Asia, it really started getting going in the 1990s and the early 2000s. So it's really, these multicultural families are really becoming a phenomenon that's happening right now. It's undergoing its way right now. So you can see the impact of that migration and how it's affecting identity process, not just for these marriage migrants and their families, but for South Korea as a whole, and how it's impacting it currently today. So you see this rural to urban migration, these government-led programs, and this whole urban phenomenon happening starting in the 1980s. And during that time, can I go back? No. Aha. Okay, so during that time, in order to help assimilate these women into South Korean society, the South Korean government decided to adopt yet another policy. And that was the idea of multiculturalism. They decided they were going to promote multiculturalism as much as possible because these women were coming in and they were fighting something that was becoming a huge societal problem in South Korea, and that was a falling fertility rate. You were having a huge aging population and not enough people to sort of balance that out. So this sort of inclusive term of multiculturalism was being promoted in some ways by the South Korean government. It was an official policy being put in place. But at the same time, despite this multicultural discourse that was happening and continues to happen today, what we have is also this idea of foreigner and foreignness. This idea has sort of created this we versus them, this us and you kind of dichotomy that sort of separates out people who are not Korean with people who are Korean. But for the marriage migrants, that's not going to work. You can't have a dichotomy for these women because they're becoming part of Korean families, they're having Korean children, they're raising the next generation of Koreans. So what we also have as part of this multicultural discourse is words like marriage migrants, foreign wives. So the idea of marriage migrant is something that implies motherhood. It implies someone who's going to take care of and raise the next generation. So it has more of a term of inclusivity into it as compared to this idea of foreign brides or foreigners, the general word of foreigners. And it ties in a lot with developmental discourse. So developmental discourse is something much wider. It's looking at the hierarchy of countries around the world. So, developing countries versus developed. Well, a lot of the women who were coming into Korea and marrying Korean men were women who were coming from developing worlds. And that sort of created this prejudice or discrimination in some ways, where you see a lot of Koreans talking in day-to-day life using this developmental discourse to maybe imply that Vietnamese food is unhealthy compared to Korean food, or that Filipino language will sort of taint the way that the child growing up will talk in Korean. So you have this sort of developmental discourse that's fitting in together with this multicultural discourse and seeing how it plays out into the day-to-day lives of these women. And that's important because, and that's very important for these women, and as I'll talk about later on, for the North Korean refugees as well. But it's very important because you want to take a look at ethnic nationalism, because they're already facing this sort of categories that are being placed in linguistically. You also want to take a look at how the Korean identity is formed. And a lot of it gets talked about in terms of ethnic nationalism, in terms of who is a Korean, and how do you determine that? And the idea comes from, as I was talking about earlier, North and South Korea. So when a lot of researchers have pointed out that when North and South Korea split, there was this sort of need to have a strategy or a reason to bring the two countries back together. These two countries had just split nationally, for sure, but how do you sort of maintain those ties, or in future times, how do you argue that these two countries should come back together? So sort of ethnic nationalism comes together with that. You have a shared ethnic heritage, blood ideology, a history, and that sort of spurred on this idea of ethnic nationalism, which is going to affect marriage migrants because they're living in a society that is mainly talked about or tied together using this idea of ethnic nationalism. So how does a marriage migrant fit in this if they're coming from a different country with a different heritage and a different ethnicity? So this sort of ethnic nationalism is an important idea or value that gets used around in South Korea. And it comes in part from this North and South Korea split, but also from Japanese colonization. So when the Japanese tried to colonize South Korea, they were really trying to promote sort of assimilatory tactics to bring South Korea into this Japanese imperial hierarchy. But at the same time, there are a lot of South Koreans, especially towards the end, who are resisting this idea. And the best way to fight that off, to fight off this idea that Korea should be within that hierarchy, is by saying, well, we're an independent country, we're an independent group, we're a country that has this ethnic nationalism to sort of protect us against these sort of tactics or strategies that the Japanese were trying to do during the imperial time. Hold on. Okay. So that's really important when talking about marriage migrants, because how, as I was saying earlier, how can you fit marriage migrants into this place? So one of the great pave makers for marriage migrants coming into South Korea are the Korean mothers-in-law. When a South Korean woman talks about marriage, she may talk about her Korean mother-in-law and how she grumbles and says, oh, my Korean mother-in-law, she's so hard on me, blah, 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 blah. So these marriage migrants are sort of facing a similar situation. it's the Korean mother-in-law who's ruling the household. She's the one in charge, and she's also the one in charge of getting the marriage migrant assimilated into South Korean society. She teaches her how to cook Korean food. She teaches her how to raise her children or take care of her husband or do everything in the traditional Korean way. So a lot of ways, what a Korean mother-in-law's job is to do is to teach a marriage migrant how to be a good daughter-in-law, so to speak, a good Korean daughter-in-law. So of course, if someone all of a sudden told you that your heritage and your language and your food were all bad and wasn't working well, we're all bad, what would you say? You probably wouldn't be too happy about that situation. So I'm not saying that the Korean mother-in-laws had total control over a marriage migrant situation, but a lot of the times marriage migrants would resist this sort of encroachment of their independence and their ability to raise the family the way they wanted to. But at the same time, that was sort of the day-to-day life, was trying to stay afloat and make sure that both sides were getting a good balance of what they wanted in the household. And the Korean mother-in-law's sort of ability to do this derives in part from filial piety, where the husband of the marriage migrant will feel an obligation to make his parents-in-law happy. And this is especially true if they're living in the same household, which makes it a lot harder for a marriage migrant to sort of take power for herself in a lot of ways. So a lot of marriage migrants told me that they were constantly fighting with their Korean mother-in-law, and they felt sort of upset because their husband would never take their side or would always take their mother-in-law's side. So it was a lot of power conflict that going on in a household that sort of influenced how a marriage migrant thought about her own identity. Was the Korean mother-in-law helping her think like she was Korean? And with the identity of her child, is her child Korean? Is he Vietnamese Korean? Is he Filipino Korean? Or just Filipino? And how that got played out with her own adoption of South Korean culture here in Korea. Okay. Nope. Okay. Okay. So one really important concept that turned up when I was doing research is this idea of maternal citizenship. So what you have is a lot of marriage migrants coming over and being able to sort of redefine the boundaries around them. They become the biological and cultural reproducers of Koreans, so they are the ones who are raising the next generation of Koreans. But at the same time, they're considered others. They're gendered independent, so that means that they are dependent on their husbands, they're dependent on their parents-in-law for financial help, for help with living in Korea, for help with learning Korean, pretty much everything they could possibly need because they left most of their family and resources back at home. And at the same time, they're also ethnic others. They're raising Koreans, so that gives them status and power. They're raising a child in a country that really needs children today. So in a lot of ways, as maternal citizenship sort of implies that status and power as a mother. But as a wife and as an individual, the marriage migrant doesn't get as many, doesn't have as much status and power as she would. So that's sort of what the gender dependent gets to talk about. So when talking about maternal citizenship, we're talking about the situation where somehow marriage migrants are able to blur away the divide that is created by ethnic nationalism, by blood ideology, by all the things that I was talking about earlier. And you may say, well, that's all good and well, but what does that have to do with North Korean refugees? So we take a look at how these groups of migrants connect. Because a lot of South Koreans themselves would be really surprised to hear that a North Korean refugee may have any similarities at all with migrant laborers or with marriage migrants coming from a different country. So we're taking a look at how this other group, which supposedly should more easily and quickly assimilate into South Korean society, doesn't, and in many ways shares similarities with marriage migrants. So first taking a look at this phrase that is sort of gained popularity in South Korea called namnan buknyo. Pretty much what we're talking about is a phrase that says a North Korean woman is beautiful and a South Korean man is handsome, and therefore they make the perfect marriage match. And that seems sort of, doesn't seem insulting or prejudiced or discriminatory in any way, but at the same time, even though it doesn't, it has a sort of gendered perspective that North Korean refugee women should be taking on a specific role when coming into South Korea. So, and this is an important and significant fact because almost 80% of the refugees coming from North Korea into South Korea are women. And that trend has continued for the past couple decades. So a lot of the refugees coming in are influenced by these ideas of marriage, just like the marriage migrants, of being married to bachelors in rural areas where there aren't a lot of eligible women available. So they're kind of living under the same situation, especially when you take into consideration that a lot of the North Korean refugees that I've spoken to or interviewed or talked to say that they feel sort of an acknowledgement or empathize with the situation that migrant laborers and with marriage migrants coming into South Korea. And that's a really big thing because okay, so that slide didn't make it. Okay, but that's a really big thing because you want to take a look at how the North Korean government is espousing ideas of foreign marriages and mixed blood children, so to speak, even though that's a very prejudiced term to use. But I want to give an example about a woman that I talked to who was telling me about how much discrimination she faced while she was in North Korea because her mother was from China. And in North Korea, everybody knows who your family is and where they come from, just in terms of kinship and blood. It's pretty widespread and well-known information. And that sort of gives the same discriminatory situation that a lot of marriage migrants here face. And that, although she spoke the most about it, that particular North Korean refugee, the large majority of the North Korean refugees I've spoken to so far have talked about how at least one or more of their relatives have come from China or lived in China and came over and married a North Korean. So a lot of them understand the situation marriage migrants face. And yet, even though you hear this, you still hear a lot of women vehemently saying, absolutely not, I'm ethnic Korean, I don't know if I could ever really understand a foreigner's life here in South Korea. But even though they say this, if the question's directly asked, a lot of other more subtle questions have them talking about sort of the isolation they feel, how they don't love South Korea, how they feel sort of as an other and an outsider, never fully a part of South Korean society. So that sort of talks about how much connection there is between North Korean refugees and marriage migrants, despite the fact that they're both coming from the same ethnic background. Okay. Okay, so, okay. So, I don't think that's it. Okay. So talking about North Korean refugees and their similarities to marriage migrants, there is one big difference that I'd like to point out. and one of them is the journey coming over to South Korea. So for marriage migrants, the journey coming over may be an extremely terrifying experience, but it's a very short one. It may be an 8-hour plane ride or something similar to that. The main transformative experience that I hear a lot about is getting married to a South Korean man in their hometown, or the process of arriving in South Korea and adjusting to life here. However, for a North Korean refugee, the journey from North Korea through China, mainly to China, and to South Korea is a hugely transformative process that really impacts the way they look at themselves and the way they sort of form their identity and influence the way people who help them cross over those people's identities as well. So it's sort of a back and forth process that's going on. So a lot of North Korean refugees will be going through the Christian Underground Railroad. This is one of the reasons why I take a specific look at the Christian community here in South Korea, because it's the Christian community that has probably been the #1 group that has influenced the ethnic and national identity of North Korean refugees, especially during this process when they're going from North Korea to South Korea. There are a lot of churches in China run by Chinese Koreans, and they sort of keep an eye out for North Korean refugees as they help them along and influence them, and in ways that involve talking about Korea, talking about Christianity, which for many North Korean refugees is the first time they've heard about Christianity, and what it means to be a Christian in South Korea. Because for a lot of South Korean Christians, that's a very specific way of living. The way Christianity gets talked about conveys a lot of cultural knowledge about Korea. So going through that journey over is a really important process before the North Korean refugees arrive here in South Korea. And there's another example that I wanted to give to sort of show you what kind of mindset North Korean refugees are raised in before arriving in South Korea. So, for example, there are also bachelor villages in China. They've also experienced that urban phenomenon where a lot of young eligible women are moving from rural areas into urban areas. So, because that is the case, when a North Korean refugee comes from North Korea through China, she will be in a very vulnerable position and most of the time be taken into sex trafficking rings or marriage trafficking, someone once called it. And she will be taken and sold to a Chinese man, where he will marry her and have children. But because these North Korean women are coming through China with no identification papers whatsoever, no passport, no ID, no paperwork, nothing that can show that she is from North Korea, she's in a very vulnerable position and not able to really fight this off. So there are many women who end up with Chinese men and have, I guess, Chinese Korean children. But in the cases where a Chinese soldier or a Chinese person figures out she's from North Korea, they will tell the Chinese soldiers who will deport her back to North Korea, where she will face imprisonment or possibly execution. And one of the problems with this, besides the obvious, is that if she is pregnant by a Chinese man, once she reaches the Sino-Korean border, where the Chinese soldiers will give her to the North Korean soldiers, they will either do a forced abortion or beat her until she miscarries. So these sort of tactics used by the North Korean government shows how much they are trying to promote this ethnic nationalism and this idea that there should be no impurities in the blood, in this pure blood lineage that North and South Korea have. So for some of those North Korean refugees to sort of talk about how they feel like a foreigner sometimes, or how they can empathize with the situation, I think is a very significant indication of how similar of a situation they're facing when they're coming to South Korea and assimilating. So, as I was talking about, in the journey over, a lot of North Korean refugees are exposed to the Christian narrative, especially as it fits within the Korean context. There's a lot of discourse on ethnicity and nationalism during that time. And it doesn't really stop when you finally reach over to South Korea. There's even more specific discourse on ethnicity that's being used. So the first kind of message that kind of gets relayed to North Korean refugees is this idea that they're the facilitators between North and South Korea. They're supposed to be a group of people that helps bridge the divide that was created by this division. So this message is intertwined with sort of the Christian narrative. So you have a lot of people talking about how there is this blessed mission given over by the divine will of God for North Korean refugees to help bridge over, or help with reunification, or help spread Christianity, any of the above. And this gets talked about in a way that helps. One North Korean refugee described it as a purpose in life, or how she gets close to God. So these sort of discussions or narratives or discussions of how these two countries should be brought together by the North Korean refugees exerts a lot of influence on how they feel about their identity and in South Korea, their purpose, or how they feel about their ethnic background and heritage. So they talk about that, but then in the meantime, what are they going to do? Because reunification could happen tomorrow, it could happen in 10 years, it could happen never. So a lot of North Korean refugees and the people who support them are also talking about, well, that's true, but how do I look at myself today or tomorrow in terms of the smaller pieces, not just looking at this reunification, broad picture type message that's being sent. All right. Okay. So to sort of fill in that gap where people are wondering how to assimilate more completely into South Korean life, or maybe not at all. A lot of people are becoming a part of the Christian schools and Christian assimilation programs. So that doesn't necessarily mean that these programs or the schools themselves are espousing Christian gospel from the outset. It's usually a much more subtle process that's occurring where it's a non-religious organization, but a lot of the members are Christian, or they talk about the Christianity, or maybe there's, Psalms poster up somewhere, or some other discussions about Christianity in the Bible going on. So between that and the churches, there's this network that gets created that allows these North Korean refugees to begin to assimilate into South Korean society, but also transforms the way they think about their identity in terms of ethnicity, but also their cultural identity. Because for them, that's a really big thing. A lot of them feel like their ethnic background is something that does bring them together with South Korea, but culturally, they feel very, very different. And that impacts how they feel about their identity as a whole. So looking at that, so looking at that, you can also see that on a more, you can look at it when looking at the different church levels. So you have the larger corporate church level and the smaller home church level. So a lot of the corporate churches will bring in North Korean refugees, believing in this mission that they're there to help with the reunification of the Koreas. And they'll pay them to attend worship services or give them a stipend for being a member, but they never truly become part of that social group or that community in these corporate churches. And then you have these smaller home churches that really seem to help more with assimilating into South Korea. And I look at churches also because a lot of the marriage migrants were using Catholic churches, especially the Filipino women, and other Christian churches in order to help them adapt to South Korean life and to find each other and to have social events through those churches. And the way that the churches sort of promote certain events is also an important influence on the identity process of North Korean refugees, which was the same for marriage migrants because they would also be attending sermons or prayer meetings, and that would help them sort of be in a more inclusive group within South Korean society. But for North Korean refugees, there are also some pretty unique events that are going on for them that influence the way they think about themselves and their identity. So for example, there are symbolic events where you have North Korean choir groups and a South Korean choir group, and they'll go to an event together, and the North Korean choir group will sing traditional North Korean songs, and then the South Korean choir group will go next and sing South Korean traditional songs. And then the end of the event will be these two big groups of choirs coming together, and they sing together and they sing Arirang, which is a very nationalistic song here in South Korea. And it sort of symbolizes the coming together of these two groups. So that and trips to foreign countries for missionary workshops are especially important, I think, for how North Korean refugees see themselves here in South Korea. So what a church will do is they will send North Korean refugees to a foreign country, the Philippines, Malaysia, anywhere outside of Korea. And they'll go there for a week or two missionary workshop. And the reason they do this is because once the North Korean refugee is outside of South Korea and into this completely different cultural world, they sort of start feeling more Korean. Their feelings of Koreanness sort of expand, as one of them said. So the reason that they invest in these sort of things is because they want them to not feel like South Korea isn't home, but they want the South Korean Christians and church members want them to feel like South Korea and North Korea should be really coming together. They want them to feel like part of this group here in South Korea. So these trips to foreign countries are one way that they do this. Okay, so so the final thing that I really wanted to talk about was pushing for reunification. So a lot of human rights activists for North Korea are Christian missionaries or Christian pastors here in South Korea. And they'll do human rights events or talks about reunification, prayer meetings, many of which involve North Korean refugees coming and participating in. So it becomes another path for North Korean refugees to come to a place together with other South Koreans and sort of get to know South Koreans and be able to integrate themselves within South Korean society. And a lot of refugees talk about how these groups made them feel more loving towards a country that before they had felt very isolated and not quite happy. They felt discriminated against, and these kinds of things help sort of the broader tone of ethnic identity. It brings together the Christian narrative along with this ethnic nationalism and enmeshes them together so that it sort of talks about the North Korean refugee identity in a much broader sense and not just on a microscopic individual one. So there were supposed to be pictures on all the slides, but yeah, sorry, maybe if any of you guys have questions I can send pictures out or something, but that was pretty much the last topic that I wanted to talk about.
So we're going to do about 10 minutes for questions.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Hey, I'm sorry, maybe you mentioned this in the beginning, and I just didn't hear but how have you found people to talk to, people to interview with, and like what sorts of ways have you, because I feel like a lot of these things are very personal, and it's sometimes hard to like gain that relationship with the person. So how has that been? Like where have you found like potential leads, or like how have you found this connection?
Right. Well, that's a really good question because it's really hard to answer in some ways because each person, you're right, they are talking about very personal things. So sometimes the person had just met me that morning and we just had an interview, and it's a 3-hour long interview. So after the first hour, a lot of people start feeling more comfortable with me and they really start talking in more detail about their lives and what they experienced. Other times, as I mentioned with participant observation events, so like the English tutoring helps a lot. If I see them every week for 4 months, they really get to know me and they feel comfortable with me and they're willing to do an interview. A lot of the times it's just people introducing me to other people and they feel comfortable with that person, and so they feel like if I'm a friend of that person, well then I don't mind doing an interview. But a lot of the times it's also attending the right events, going to pretty much everything, and trying to meet as many people as possible. Yeah.
Yeah. To what extent do you see especially the marriage migrant mothers sharing their culture with their children? I feel like I kind of know the answer to that.
What do you think your answer is?
Which is like not very often, right? Is that? I mean, do you see that at all, or do you see like the children who they're like they know both languages, or they love like?
That's really rare that they know both languages.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely because the Filipino migrants had come earlier, more than the Vietnamese ones. The Vietnamese migrants I talked to usually came in the early 2000s, whereas the Filipino ones have been here for a really long time. So they had a much easier time of passing down their sort of cultural heritage to their children. But it's very rare, language-wise, it's very rare for anyone to get anything that way. But in terms of like food, cultural customs, how the Filipino way of placing the table, or different holidays, things like that, those do get conveyed along the way.
Okay.
But also because the Vietnamese women came in the early 2000s, a lot of their kids were like 5 or 6. So it's really hard to tell what kind of impact their lives, this sort of life will have on them growing older.
And then I guess a follow-up question is like, do you see some kind of like disconnect between the mother and the child then? Because they're supposed to be raising Korean children, but like their kids aren't Korean, right? They're Korean Vietnamese or Korean Filipino. So do you feel like the mother isn't able to connect to their child as much because they just can't share that part
Right. So, well, that's actually interesting because even though they're Korean Vietnamese or Korean Filipina, like a lot of them resist that idea. Like the older ones will definitely say, "No, I'm Korean. Like I'm not Korean Vietnamese. I'm not Korean Filipino or Filipina. I'm definitely ethnically and culturally Korean. I may have a lot of ties to other countries, and I may know a lot of things. And my mother may be from a different country, but they sort of separate out." Those two ideas. And so yeah, there is sometimes this like barrier between the two. And actually there's a huge barrier between the marriage migrant and her husband because of like a language barrier. Because the husband will speak Korean and the marriage migrant won't. So like it's just like overall the household is a lot of times using body language or just a dictionary to communicate with each other. So yeah, in a lot of ways, there was one household I went to, and her mother-in-law absolutely refused to let her teach Vietnamese to her child. She said it would screw up his Korean, he'd be made fun of in school, etc., etc. And even though she was learning Korean, like she had just arrived in Korea a couple months ago, so really at that point her son was maybe 6 years old, and they were just. He was a kid, so she could use a lot of body language, but she felt so upset and so angry and frustrated by the situation. And a lot of times it results in the foreign bride or marriage migrant running away from home and going back to their country. And a lot of them would, except they have children here, so they wouldn't leave them behind.
I'm curious if you have figures on just how many marriage migrants we're talking about, and then it's kind of a connected question to that. Is there enough? Are there enough migrants that kind of foreign communities have formed in some of these bachelor villages where they have like a community of support to use their own language?
So to answer the first part of your question, in terms of statistics, there was supposed to be a chart, but they predict by 2020 that 20% of the households in Korea will be a multicultural family. So yeah, it's definitely something that is rising rapidly in Korea. It's mainly from Southeast Asian countries, so but a lot of the older ones are Chinese Korean. So it's interesting because statistics-wise, how do you differentiate between a Chinese marriage migrant coming and the Southeast Asian marriage migrant coming? So some of the statistics end up coming up a little bit different. And your second question was, I'm sorry, I forgot.
Just are there communities where, for example, are there enough Filipina women in the same small community that they can have their own kind of support network, and is that a way to kind of continue their culture?
Right, definitely. And actually that kind of goes back to Amelia's question about how do I meet these people and how do I interview them? Because they do kind of come together and create their own social networks and support groups. And so like that birthday party that I mentioned before, they all got together and cooked Filipino food and listened to Filipino music, and pretty much just were a bunch of marriage migrants coming together and sharing in their cultural heritage. And so they are sometimes a really tight-knit group. But at the same time, a lot of them are going through these multicultural centers run by the government, and that also becomes a way for marriage migrants in general to be coming together. So it may not just be a group of Filipino women, but anyone who's coming from Thailand, China, just coming together and sharing in pretty much the same situation. Yeah, so.
Okay, so this is kind of bouncing off of Amelia's question as well. But when it comes to North Korean defectors, one, how did you initially tap into this community? And two, how do you now, I don't know what your sort of your language ability in Korean is, but how do you navigate linguistic and cultural differences when interviewing North Korean defectors? Because my research is on defectors too, and I feel that they're a highly politicized group, so I think there is definitely maybe some other groups of people, there's such a trust aspect to it as well. So I'm curious as to whether you use a translator or how you've managed to do that thus far.
Right, so my Korean is sort of like intermediate level, so I definitely understand much more than I talk. So I always bring with me a translator, especially since we're talking about very abstract ideas like identity or anything like that. So I do understand a lot of what's happening in the interview, especially at this point, like midway through the period, through this research project. But sort of the way that I got to know the North Korean refugees here, it was really complicated because I pretty much emailed, called, talked to everybody I knew, and I came here and I would just show up at events or just be like, hey, like I'm a researcher, you're a North Korean refugee, do you want to be friends with me and let's talk. Like that's what my research involves a lot of, is just kind of like being awkwardly sticking my face in people's business and hoping they respond in the right way. And sometimes they do, sometimes they are suspicious of what's going on. And not just because they're a highly politicized group here in South Korea, but also because of their mindset while living in North Korea. One North Korean refugee was telling me while we were doing an interview, she felt very nervous because the translator and I were writing notes. And that meant in North Korea that someone was going to tell on you to the government. So for sure, it takes a lot of persuading to convince people not only to talk to me about some really personal and highly politicized things, but also to let me record it. Like that makes them very nervous. So sometimes they'll agree and then they decide they don't want to when they see that there's a forum involved or that someone else is coming in and it's not just me. So it does get kind of complicated. Oh, sorry.
Okay. So first of all, thank you so much. I feel like you're doing so much in this project. It seems really awesome. So from what I understood about like the identity formation or identity of South Koreans, I understood a kind of tension between identity as like ethnicity and blood related, and then identity as informed by culture, like this imagined society of what it means to be Korean.
Right.
And I'm wondering if in your interviews with the marriage migrants, you have talked to them about what they envision assimilation to be, if they are obviously like not going to be able to assimilate like the ethnicity part, or even if assimilation is one of their goals at all.
Right, exactly. So one of the reasons I hate these projects and like doing a presentation is because I really would love to give these broad like trends, like, you know, 50% of the marriage migrants said this and 50% said that, but it's a lot of unique situations and a lot of ambiguity going on in their lives. So when they talk about their own identity or what kind of adoption they want of society, they sometimes just give me conflicting answers or feel they're not 100% sure of which way they want to go. So, and I have had marriage migrants, some of them say, well, yeah, now I'm Korean. I have a Korean citizenship. I speak Korean for the most part. I have Korean children. Now I'm Korean. But then you have others who's like, absolutely not. I'll be back in the Philippines in 10 years with my husband. Like, I'm a Filipina. Like, you can't take that away from me, even though I have a Korean citizenship. So for a lot of them, it's almost each individual case of how much they want to adopt South Korean society, how much they want to let their children become Korean, so to speak. It just kind of depends on who's saying what. And it's really interesting because a lot of which country they come from is also kind of important. So I'll say that at least a lot of the Filipino women told me that they feel very Filipino, but it was more often that the Vietnamese women would tell me, oh, I feel more Korean, or I feel more assimilated into South Korean society. But a lot of the times, they never seem bothered by the fact, at least the ones with older kids, never seem bothered by the fact that their children felt Korean. I mean, they just love their kids, so it was sort of like one of those things where they're, oh yeah, my kid's Korean, but you know, look how big he is and beautiful, like, you know, like, it doesn't matter, like, I still love him. So, it just sort of, yeah, it sort of depended on kind of individual cases on how they felt about that.
Did you feel like in situations where if you could tell if the relationship between the husband and wife or relationship between the daughter-in-law and the mother-in-law were better, that they felt more Korean, or that they were more willing to say that they were Korean?
Depending on like what kind of mother-in-law they had?
Or just depending on the relationship they have.
Okay.
Maybe not what kind of
Right. So, yeah, that's an interesting question. It also kind of depended on whether or not they were living with their mother-in-law or not. But for a lot of them, the first couple months were almost always rocky with their mother-in-law. So, and that kind of, I mean, there's just some really bad stories involved there, you know, like a Korean mother-in-law will walk away her daughter every time her friends come over, kind of thing. So they feel a lot of resistance towards this idea of, like, do I want to assimilate in this kind of country? Like, I'm being locked away, like, how dare you do that to me? So, and then there's others who the Korean mother-in-law really helped her out, or really loved her, or kind of dotes on her. And so, like, in that particular instance, the one I'm talking about, she liked Korea, she liked her family here, but she didn't feel Korean. So I think it's also one of those things, like, how attached are you to feeling the identity of your home country? So once again, it's sort of, I get out of answering by saying it's each individual case, but yeah.
Okay.